Turning now to the trade war with the U.S., one that is dragging on with no end in sight. Canada has yet to set a date with the U.S. for bilateral talks on the upcoming Trade Pact review, even after Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc met with his counterpart in Washington last week. Instead, we're hearing the feds announce more support for affected workers, with Ontario securing $228.8 million in federal funding over 3 years. Part of that funding is going to help train a target of 27,000 workers, largely in the biggest trade-exposed softwood lumber, steel, and automotive sectors. Now, are these supports a sign that talks with the U.S. are not advancing? Patty Hajdu is the Minister of Jobs and Families. Welcome to the show. Minister, $228.8 million to Ontario today, $70.4 to BC last week. Is this a sign that the feds are giving up on any progress for tariff relief coming soon?
Well, not at all. This is an insurance policy for Canadian workers. And look, these sectors have already been deeply impacted. In Ontario, for example, in the auto sector, steel sector, and forestry sector, we've seen layoffs, we've seen changes in production planning by corporations, and this is about making sure that we have Canadian workers' backs while they transition either with that company or to new companies, to new products and new markets.
Well, on that, asked whether this would allow, for example, Algoma Steel to rehire any workers. Algoma VP Laura Devoni wasn't able to guarantee that. In fact, saying that they could have plans to have people reskilled or rehired in the future. If these funds are not helping to save jobs now, is it just delaying the inevitable in Ontario?
Well, no, not at all. In fact, we see a really uneven pattern of employment across the province and indeed across the country. We've got these really exposed sectors that have been heavily hit by tariffs that are experiencing, a reduction in production or a reduced ability to sell to the United States, or the need to rapidly pivot to new product or new markets. But we also see in other sectors a really big demand for labor. So the intent behind the funds announced today is to empower the provinces and territories, in this case the province of Ontario, with the signed agreement to more quickly reach out to affected workers, to be able to help them through that job transition process. And obviously we'll be working in partnership with the province to make sure that they get any income supports while while workers are doing this work.
I hear what you're saying, but it does sound like you're saying, okay, there still may be layoffs, and layoffs may not be reversed. And if that's the case, if I'm a steel worker in Ontario facing a layoff or having already been laid off, what's your message to me?
Well, my message to you is that we're going to make sure that we have your back together with the province of Ontario. And look, I don't think anyone's naive enough to think that tariffs aren't going to impact the Canadian economy, that are designed to impact the Canadian economy. You used the word trade war in your opening comments, and that's exactly what Canadians are feeling. They're feeling the pressure not only for their own families, but for the families and their community around them. And Canadians have been stepping up to protect each other. Obviously, the federal government has put into place a number of employment insurance measures to make sure that if people are in the position of losing their job, that they are able to rapidly access income supports. But this is the next step. Nobody wants to stay on EI forever. And given that there are other employment opportunities, sometimes right in the neck of the woods of that particular worker, we want to make sure that workers are not struggling to figure out what the next step is, where they go for help with, for example, getting themselves resume ready, whether they can get additional training that helps them move, in some cases, to companies down the road that are looking for skilled trades labor, skilled labor in a variety of different manufacturing settings. And so this is an agreement with the province of Ontario, not only in terms of sufficiency of funding to do that, but in the partnership, so that those workers can be immediately contacted by the province of Ontario and immediately connected to the supports they need for a successful transition to the next job.
So you've given some hints there of sort of the reaching out from companies to laid off workers, but just let's break it down, because announcements can be very high level and this might be a bit processy, but how do laid off workers get access to these supports?
Well, there is an information sharing that will happen between the province of Ontario and the federal government, and so people will be contacted proactively to be able to participate in the supports available. In some cases, there's actual centers that are open in large employers where workers that are either have been given notice that they may be laid off or they're experiencing a layoff can walk right into that center where there'll be professionals from both the province of Ontario and the federal government there to help that worker navigate those next steps, whether it is getting onto EI right away, whether it's making sure they have access to all the tools they need to, in many cases, update their resume, to figure out what kinds of work is available, to connect with Job Bank. And these kinds of supports have been evidence to really help when a person is experiencing that kind of overwhelming anxiety that happens when you're losing your job, especially for long tenured workers that have maybe been out of the workforce out of the work search field for a very long time. It's hard to contemplate starting the work to look for a new job, and yet there are great positions available. And so this collaboration with the province of Ontario is work really at all levels of government to make sure that workers that are impacted by tariffs and are facing job loss don't feel that they have to go through that alone. In fact, there's practical tools available on the ground from both the federal government and the province of Ontario.
Now, these are not the first supports that your government has put into place, either for workers or industry, since the tariff war began. Do we have a sense of the uptake by both workers and industry in terms of whether we're talking loans for liquidity or in terms of jobs? And there's, of course, EI was extended to long-term employees. Just wondering if we have a sense of the uptake and the programs you had previously announced.
Yeah, well, we are actually getting uptake both by employers for example, work sharing. When there's a decline in the amount of work, employers can actually utilize work sharing to keep employees attached to their workforce. We're sensing some real positive movement from affected employers in utilizing that approach because it allows for workers to stay with the company, but also get paid for those days that they're not actually physically working at the plant. There is also a really positive feedback from unions and from other workers around the changes to EI that have been put into place to make sure that people can get EI without waiting at all, to be able to hold on to their severance so there's no withholding of funds that are owed to a worker upon separation from their employment, and to be able to have extra weeks in the case of long tenured workers who, as I just mentioned, often face additional barriers to getting a new job.
Now, you've been to BC. We have this Ontario announcement. Do we have a sense of what province might be next in terms of one of these arrangements?
I can't tell you which province will be next, but I can tell you that all provinces and territories are working diligently with the federal government right now, and announcements across the country will be rolling out in the days and weeks to come.
In terms of the trade war, we did have the Supreme Court in the U.S., that decision that invalidated the IEEPA tariffs, which unfortunately does not actually have any material impact for the tariffs that Canada is facing most predominantly in those sectors we've been talking about, those Section 232 tariffs. Do you have a sense, I know you're not the minister in charge, but you are in cabinet, do you have a sense whether those sectoral tariffs will be part of the CUSMA review, or is our only hope to deal with those in a separate process, like with Dominic LeBlanc going to Washington last week?
Look, that's the work that my colleagues are doing. They're working to protect Canada's interests vis-a-vis the United States, to make sure that we have a commitment from the United States to review CUSMA, to work on alleviating the tariffs that these specific sectors are facing. My job as the Minister of Jobs and Families is to be there for workers, to be there for families, and that's exactly what today's announcement's about. It is preparing for any outcome. And ultimately, there are many things we cannot control, as the Prime Minister says, but one thing that we can do is we can stand with workers and we can stand with companies as they do that hard work of pivoting to new product and new market.
Thank you very much, Minister. We got a little frozen there at the end, but we did hear what you had to say, so thank you for joining us. Patty Hajdu is the Minister of Jobs and Families. As the U.S. trade war drags on with no end in sight, the federal government is committing more money to the workers hardest hit. The feds are putting up nearly $229 million over 3 years to help Ontario workers gain new skills. A similar announcement was made last week for BC workers. It's expected to cover training for 27,000 people across Ontario.
There are lots of things that we can't control. It is a very uncertain time for Canadians. Indeed, it's a very uncertain time for global citizens. But in Canada, we can choose resiliency. We have chosen unity. We've chosen collaboration across provinces, across territories, with local employers, and that's how we build Canada strong.
So bringing back the power panel after that little break. Jamie, what did you make of the new supports announced today?
To me, it tells me that the government has no expectation of a deal anytime soon, that they are going to continue to support affected industries. And given the number of time that has passed, they had to top up those supports. And the government is trying to manage what is going to be a transitionary period for a lot of these workers who are directly impacted by this in our economy, while continuing to hope that one day maybe they'll have a deal with the US and that free trade is restored as we knew it. But I don't think that's happening. And so I think this is just a very blunt recognition that more supports are needed for impacted industries, and reminds Canadians that there's still no deal.
Shachi, what's your take on that? In terms of the sectoral tariffs versus the overall CUSMA review, are these, at least the sectoral tariffs, here to stay?
I don't have any more of a crystal ball than the rest of us, but I would say that Canada's actually holding more trump cards, no pun intended there, actually, than they think they do. I am in possession of data that is going to be released in the next 12 hours that is going to show the extent to which Americans are not buying the Trump rationale for tariffs, that are wholesale not buying the desire for punitive, damaging tariffs on Canada, and who do accept and understand the importance of Canada as an important trading partner, as a key trading partner. So the question now is, okay, if we're seeing Americans moving in that direction, not really buying what Trump is trying to sell on all of these arguments to punish not only Canada, but a number of international trading partners, there's a couple of factors here. First of all, how does Canada turn that into leverage? Well, they've got to do that by ensuring that Americans, even if they think a certain way about something, are motivated to vote a certain way about something. And that is the gap that Canadians need, that the Canadian government needs to fill, that Canada needs to fill in communicating directly to Americans. Hey, we already know you're kind of on our side about this, so you got to make that the number one voting issue. And they have to be able, Canadians, the Canadian government, the Carney government, Janice Charette needs to be able to draw the line between housing affordability, cost of living, general affordability in the United States, and the tariffs that American consumers are paying. If they can do that, there may actually be some room to put pressure on this White House administration. But it's really, as I say, Canadians may well be holding some cards here. It's how are you going to play them?
Supriya, what's your take on what today's announcement indicates about how trade negotiations are going?
I mean, look, I think supports for tariffs are always better than no supports for tariffs, right? So ultimately, this is, I guess, a good thing that the government is out there to support people whose industries have been impacted by, all the Trump trade madness. But I don't think we can really expect any level of real certainty about how things are going or where things stand until we've actually got a signed deal in place. And even then, as we now know, signed deals that were negotiated by Trump himself don't really mean much to this White House. So even if we do get a deal, we're not really sure how long it will last before Trump starts posting something to Truth Social that would completely negate that deal. And I don't want to sound too much like a Debbie Downer here, but it's just from my perspective, it seems that as long as Trump is in the White House, it's going to be very difficult for Canadians to fully rest easy with regards to trade with the U.S. And then I would just say that the other thing we should probably be mindful of as a country is that the Trump administration has said with much more vigor this time around than they did the last time that we negotiated CUSMA, is that it's entirely possible that the CUSMA deal gets effectively replaced with separate bilateral deals between, the U.S. and Mexico, and then the U.S. and Canada, and then presumably between Mexico and Canada. And I think Canadians need to, at least somewhere in their mindset, be prepared for that potential outcome.
Nathan, in terms of the supports announced today, they're not the first ones that have been announced. I wonder whether you think it's also a recognition that what had been put in place up to this point wasn't doing enough, and that industry and workers were saying you need to do more.
Well, let's look at the scale of what we're talking about. 50,000 manufacturing jobs so far that have been impacted directly, lost directly because of the tariffs, according to some studies. Conference Board, I believe, estimates another 160,000 jobs are at risk. So the numbers that you put up at the beginning of this question are not at scale, and workers will know that. We've lost 8,000 forestry sector jobs in BC alone because of the 45% tariffs we've been facing. Provinces are right and to take some money from the feds for support. But one thing I would challenge a little bit is there's talk about this in this emergent moment. The language changed in this, away from emergency type funding that happens when there's an event or a downturn, to structural changes within these sectors. Manufacturing, value added, the things that Trump is targeting. Sachi is right that if we don't make the case to American voters walking into the booths at these midterm elections, and Congress refuses to grow a spine or anything else that would actually counter the president's absolutely insane trade policies, insane for his own people, right? Like, never mind the impact on friends, but the American consumer. I think one imagines the impact of this, our first topic, the war in Iran, that goes for another month and gas prices stay high. That could be a lot more persuasive to anything on the trade policy front than anything our officials, as brilliant as they are in Washington, are doing. And does that roll all the way over into the midterms in the fall? Does Trump lose at least the Congress, if not the Senate? Now we're talking about actually putting maybe a little bit of brakes or sanity, dare I say it, on U.S. trade policy for the next 2 years. Otherwise, we just got to find a way to wait this guy out. And that is so painful for the workers losing their jobs right now. The announcement's fine. I don't want to be overly critical of it, despite my opposition days. But the scale doesn't seem to meet the moment. Like, we're talking orders of magnitude more workers impacted than these announcements are addressing in Ontario and BC, with more to come, unfortunately.
But in trying to, persuade, and Shachi talked about this as well, the American public, do we take the message directly to them? As we saw what happened when Ontario tried to do that with its ad, or do we cross our fingers that what's happening does do it on its own without us needing to do anything?
I mean, to Spriya's earlier point, you don't want to trigger the guy, I'm talking about Trump, just unnecessarily, but you also need to make your case. I mean, I'm sure the Canadian officials have thought about this if they haven't done it already. I'd have the congressional map out. I'd be circling the states. We know them. We know the districts that are in play. This is not rocket surgery. We can actually find the congressional members, particularly Republicans who are vulnerable, in 6 months' time, and I'd target the hell out of them. Why not? I mean, they're, aside from the policy, they're just being so weak to their own constitution. And I would remind some of their voters that they are supposed to be in charge of this stuff. They are choosing not to, never mind war, but trade policy and tariffs. And they're hurting their own constituents as they bend the knee to Trump because they're afraid of getting taken out in a primary. Gosh, I just thought so much more of America and their leadership, despite many criticisms. I just think this is a moment for Canada. I thought Ford's ad was great. To quote Reagan, they don't have to quote us. Let's just talk to them about their own beliefs, and that they're getting hit at the grocery store. They're getting hit when they try to buy a home because of this guy in the White House thinks the answer to every single question in the world is tariff and now war, things that do America and the world more harm by far than any good.
Jamie, Mexico has set a date for bilateral talks with the U.S. Canada does not have a date yet. How concerned are you about that?
I'm not, because I think if history is my history on this is accurate, you saw the U.S. administration the last time they renegotiated NAFTA kind of start with bilateral conversations. At some point, there also was bilateral Canada-Mexico conversations before it then became this trilateral agreement. And so I think the issues looking south are very different to when Americans look north. And every day that Canada can kind of probably not be top of mind in the White House and continue to benefit from USMCA, putting over 90% of trade into the country tariff-free, is probably a better day for Canada than getting the president in a mercurial mood, lashing out on Truth Social in response to, again, Supriya's preferred term, pokey in the eye.
Supriya, I want to just ask you quickly about...
I'm using this, Supriya. I'm running with it.
Copyright.
I like
Copyright.
Trademark. The Dominic LeBlanc met with Jameson Greer last week, and I don't know how encouraged any of us are after that meeting. We don't have a date, no relief on sectoral tariffs. What are your thoughts on what we make out of a meeting like that, kind of high profile, but doesn't seem like anything came from it?
I think like a lot of these meetings, once they're, out in the public sort of consciousness and we all know about it, we should be cautiously optimistic. I think it's a positive sign that, back at the negotiating table, we were just talking about the Doug Ford Ontario ad, of course, and the Trump team kind of famously took their ball home and walked away with it. And so it's good that the talks are sort of moving in that right direction. I think it's positive, but I don't think we can, again, for everything everyone has said on the panel up until this point, kind of just look at that one meeting and go, okay, mission accomplished. Like there's still a much more to be done. But I think it, as a nation, I don't think it benefits us in any way if we get our panties in a bunch every time there's a meeting and there isn't something tangible and concrete that has come out of this, because I think, most people would probably recognize that we're inching closer and closer to this running out the clock until probably if I'm mixing my metaphors here, the last 24 seconds of a shot clock.
Speaking of a shot clock, Shachi, last word to you in 30 seconds, your take.
Noted. All right. Let's not miss our opportunity here. So Supriya talks about panties in a bunch. I talk about knickers in a twist. I think the other piece that we cannot get our knickers in twists about is every time Donald Trump has a hissy fit on social media or otherwise, or is petulant. At what point do people in this country, do people in any country really internalize the fact that this is not a leader, nor is his government one that has any particular respect for the rules? Not when it comes to trade, not when it comes to war, not when it comes to lots of things. So, what does he ultimately, what is he healed by? HEELED? What does he respect? It's political pressure. It's not doing things by the rules, and it's not being afraid. It's not, we can be as quiet and soft-spoken and softly, gently as we want to be. He is going to go looking for a reason to take his ball off the court at any time. So we got to take our shot. How's that?
Great, thank you, and very succinct. Thank you to the Power Panel, Supriya Dwivedi, Jamie Ellerton, Nathan Cullen, and Shachi Kurl.